For almost half a century, the entire world lived under this massive shadow, a conflict like no other. Yet two global superpowers, each with enough nuclear weapons to literally end civilization, locked in this intense struggle for dominance. So the big question is, how on earth did this 50-year standoff never actually turn hot?
Well, the name itself, Cold War, is a huge clue. It was cold because the two main players, the United States and the Soviet Union, never went to war directly with each other on a massive scale. Instead, they fought in other ways, through propaganda, spying, a crazy arms race, and by backing opposite sides in other countries' wars.
And at its very core, this was a clash between two completely opposite ways of seeing the world. You had the US and its allies, all about capitalism, free markets, and democracy. And then you had the Soviet Union and its allies, pushing for communism and a state-controlled economy. Each side saw the other as a genuine threat to its existence. The US wanted to stop communism from spreading, while the USSR was working to make it a global reality.
Okay, so to get our heads around this, here's our game plan. We'll look at how it all started, see how that Iron Curtain fell, get into the scariest moments when we were on the brink, watch the wall come down, and finally touch on how we're still feeling the effects of it all today.
All right, let's dive right in. First up, how the Cold War began, and how the world went from allies to enemies, seemingly overnight.
It's honestly wild how fast the alliance that defeated Nazi Germany just crumbled. I mean, right after the war, Europe was split in two. The big conferences at Yalta and Potsdam were supposed to figure out the future, but instead, they just showed how deep the disagreements were. The US and Britain were pushing for countries to choose their own futures, but Stalin? Nope. He was determined to build a buffer zone of friendly communist states to protect the Soviet Union.
And these weren't just lines on a map for long. They quickly became very real, physical divisions. That brings us to our second section. An Iron Curtain descends, literally splitting a continent in half. This new reality was captured perfectly by Winston Churchill in 1946. He gave this famous speech where he said, "An Iron Curtain has descended." And that phrase, it just stuck, because it so perfectly described this new, hostile barrier that was dividing Europe.
So what was behind that curtain? Well, the Soviet Union set up communist governments in one country after another. This whole group of nations became known as the Eastern Bloc. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, all of them fell under Soviet control, totally cut off from the West. And then things got really official. The divisions were cemented with military power. In 1949, the West created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was basically a promise. Attack one of us, you attack all of us. Naturally, the Soviets responded. They created the Warsaw Pact, their own military alliance for the Eastern Bloc. The lines were drawn. The world was now split into two massive armed camps.
And this is where things get really, really scary. This brings us to the most dangerous part of the entire conflict. Section 3, a world on the brink, racing towards destruction.
The fear that defined this whole era came from the nuclear arms race. First, the US builds the atomic bomb. Just 4 years later, the Soviets have one too. Then the US builds the hydrogen bomb, which is way more powerful. The result of all this was a terrifying idea called mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. It's a crazy concept, right? The idea wasn't to win a war, it was to prevent one, because both sides knew that if anyone launched their missiles, everyone would be completely annihilated. The rivalry wasn't just about weapons, though. It was also a battle for hearts and minds, which played out in the space race. Every launch was a victory for an entire ideology. The Soviets jumped out to an early lead, stunning the world with the Sputnik satellite, then putting the first man in space. But the biggest symbolic win of all, that went to the US with the moon landing in 1969. Back here on Earth, that division became brutally real. In 1961, East Germany put up the Berlin Wall, a massive concrete barrier that just sliced the city in two. It wasn't just a wall, it was the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, locking people in and tearing families apart for decades.
So with all this tension, all this posturing, you have to ask the scariest question of all. How close did we actually get to the absolute unthinkable?
The answer really comes down to one number, 90. 90 miles. That's how close Soviet nuclear missiles were to the US coast during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. For 13 straight days, the world just held its breath as the two superpowers stood on the very edge of war. It was, without a doubt, the closest humanity has ever come to global nuclear annihilation.
After hitting that peak of terror, the end of the Cold War came with a speed that just shocked everybody. So let's get into Section 4, The Wall Comes Down, the Thaw and the Fall.
So what happened? What flipped the switch? Well, the change actually came from inside the Soviet Union. The new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, started these two radical new policies. One was glasnost, which means openness, allowing a little more freedom of speech. The other was perestroika, a restructuring of the failing Soviet economy. The crazy thing is, he was trying to save communism, but instead he accidentally created the cracks that would bring the whole thing down.
And those cracks became a flood. On one incredible night, November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, that ultimate symbol of division, came crashing down. People were celebrating, climbing on the wall. These images were broadcast all over the world, and everyone knew this was the end of an era.
It's honestly hard to wrap your head around how fast everything unraveled after that. The wall falls in '89, and then revolutions just sweep across the rest of Eastern Europe. By 1990, Germany is one country again. And then, just 2 years after the wall came down, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself just dissolved. The Cold War was over.
So that brings us to our final section. What did the world look like after the dust settled? Let's talk about the echoes of the conflict and the New World Order.
The end of the Cold War totally redrew the map of the world. Politically, the United States was left as the planet's only superpower. Economically, capitalism rushed into all those former communist countries. And on the military front, nuclear weapons were cut way back, but NATO actually expanded, a decision that has had huge consequences we're still dealing with today.
And all of this leaves us with one big, lingering question. The Cold War, as we know it, is definitely over. But when you look at the world today, at the tensions between democracies and authoritarian countries, you have to wonder, did the war actually end, or did it just change its name?